Elderly folks like you, belonging to a different class, shouldn't attend the housewarming party. Henrietta, our daughter-in-law, declared loudly with a condescending look. Her audacity left us astounded and speechless. I had tolerated Henrietta's remarks for Warren's sake, but her disrespectful attitude finally pushed me over the edge. My husband, Reagan, shared my sentiment. We exchanged glances, nodded in agreement, and confronted Henrietta. "Understood," she said, smiling smugly before returning to Warren. "I am Bridget, 73 years old, and Warren is our son with Reagan." Warren had always been reserved but came into his own in college. After graduating high school, he found a job and eventually brought home a quiet woman he was seriously dating. Despite her nervous demeanor, her sincerity in wanting to marry Warren won us over, and we happily consented to their marriage. 3 years into their marriage, during Christmas, Warren and his wife were coming home for the first time. I was excited, having let them spend their first Christmas alone. Henrietta, initially shy, gradually relaxed and seemed to get along with Reagan. As darkness fell, I prepared dinner, and Henrietta offered to help in the kitchen. As we stood there, an unfamiliar voice disrupted the moment. "It's cold. This house is too cold," said Henrietta, her voice unexpectedly low and harsh. I turned to her in disbelief as she rubbed her hands together, wearing a discontented expression I had never seen before. Her eyes met mine, filled with undisguised displeasure. "I hate old houses like this. I really didn't want to come," she continued, her tone unhappy. Stunned and speechless at her sudden change, I struggled to comprehend her words. Just moments ago, we had been chatting cheerfully, and now she was venting her bad mood without restraint. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she sneered, her tone sharp. "It was all just an act to get married, you know. Now that we're married, I'm tired of it. Anyway, hurry up and get ready. I'm hungry." Henrietta, seemingly annoyed by my stunned silence, gestured dismissively towards the stove. I hurried to obey, shaken more deeply than I realized. I began bustling around, preparing for the visit. Henrietta, however, did nothing but dictate, not lifting a finger to help. She complained incessantly, criticizing my methods while making no effort herself. As preparations neared completion and only serving remained, Henrietta suddenly sprang into action. She charmed Reagan and Warren, blushing at their praise. It was then that I finally understood Henrietta's true nature. 10 years later, Warren and his wife were returning for a visit. Henrietta had revealed her true colors many times in my presence, always maintaining a different demeanor around Reagan and Warren. Despite my suspicions, I had remained silent, hoping it was all a misunderstanding. Yet each visit only confirmed my doubts. Upon hearing they were coming back, I felt a pang of dismay. I planned to avoid being alone with Henrietta as much as possible. When the doorbell rang, I sighed and opened the door to find Warren standing alone. Surprised by Henrietta's absence, I instinctively looked around for her. Warren, noticing my reaction, spoke with a hint of apology. "Sorry, Mom. Henrietta had some urgent work and will join us later," he explained. "It's okay to go ahead with the grave visit without her." Realizing Henrietta wouldn't be joining us until her work was finished, I felt a wave of relief. The thought of not having to witness Henrietta's behavior, even for a short while, lifted my spirits. I welcomed Warren into the house, and Reagan, noticing Henrietta's absence, asked about her. As I prepared tea, I found myself sighing deeply without realizing it. We decided to relax for the day and postpone the visit to the grave until the next day. When Warren informed Henrietta, she responded saying she couldn't finish her work in time but asked him to apologize on her behalf. Reagan brushed it off as unavoidable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Henrietta simply didn't want to attend the grave visit. I didn't voice my thoughts and reassured everyone not to worry about it. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. The following day, after visiting the grave and returning home to relax, Henrietta called to say she had finished her work and would be coming over that evening. The timing of her call immediately after the grave visit struck Reagan and Warren as odd, and it heightened my suspicion. That evening, just as we were about to have dinner, Henrietta arrived looking slightly sweaty and out of breath, as if she had rushed. I couldn't help but frown involuntarily, but Reagan and Warren were delighted to see her, so it kept quiet. Henrietta, free from work, was asked to shower first while dinner was being prepared. She agreed somewhat apologetically. At dinner time, when she saw the sandwiches on the tray, she muttered unhappily, "Sandwiches. That's it. After a hot day at the grave, I'm tired of eating this." She continued to express her dissatisfaction, saying, I managed to avoid going to someone else's grave in this heat, and all I get is a simple meal like this. As Henrietta tied up her hair and walked towards the living room, I felt anger rise within me, but I couldn't find the words to confront her. In the living room, she instantly started chatting happily with Reagan, leaving me silently frustrated. Another 10 years passed, and Warren decided to move from his apartment to a house. After discussing it with Henrietta, they decided to pay as much of the down payment themselves but asked us for a little help with the shortfall. Of course, we couldn't refuse Warren's requests, so we agreed and transferred the needed amount promptly. Soon after, Warren informed us that their new house was built, and they planned a housewarming party with both families. I hadn't seen Henrietta's parents since the wedding, so I was eager to meet them again despite everything that had transpired. When Warren invited me to attend their housewarming party next month, I readily agreed, much to his delight. He promptly shared the news with Henrietta, whom I presumed was on the other end of the phone. A few days later, Henrietta unexpectedly visited alone. I was surprised by her unannounced appearance and opened the door without realizing who it was. Who is it? I asked, looking up to see Henrietta with an unhappy expression. Taken aback, I hesitated before inviting her in. She quickly checked for keys at the entrance and pushed past me arrogantly, heading straight into the living room. She must have noticed that Reagan's keys were not there, indicating he was out for his daily walk and wouldn't be back for a while. Feeling somewhat trapped, I followed her into the living room. Henrietta stood there, waiting for me without sitting down. Before I could even close the door, she glared at me and spoke sharply. Bridget, about the housewarming party. It's a nuisance, so could you please not come? She demanded abruptly. What are you suddenly talking about? I responded, taken aback by Reagan's absence. Henrietta, crossing her arms, began speaking in a high-handed manner. You're planning to talk to my parents about me, aren't you? She accused, glaring at me with evident disgust. It was clear she didn't want her parents to know about her behavior. She must have deliberately chosen a time when Warren was at work and she had a day off, knowing Reagan's routine of taking walks. Henrietta was indeed cunning. I had no such intention, but now that you mention it, it might not be a bad idea, I replied calmly. Henrietta frowned in annoyance. It's no joke. I married Warren because he's good-looking and earns decently. I don't want to deal with annoying relatives, she explained bluntly, revealing her true reasons for marrying Warren. Her expression froze when she saw my astonished face. As I pondered Henrietta's strange behavior, the living room door opened behind me. I turned around to see Reagan, looking surprised as he observed Henrietta. Realizing her conversation with me had been overheard, Henrietta clicked her tongue but decided to brazen it out. Anyway, elderly folks like you, being of a different class, shouldn't come to the housewarming party, she declared with audacity that left us astounded and at a loss for words. I had finally reached my limit with Henrietta, who dared to say such things even in Warren's absence. I had kept silent for Warren's sake until now, but I could no longer overlook her behavior. My husband Reagan seemed to share my sentiment. We exchanged glances, nodded in agreement, and calmly told Henrietta that we understood. Satisfied, she smiled and went back to Warren. Left behind, we felt suddenly weary and sat down on the sofa. On the day of the housewarming party, we decided not to go to Warren and his wife's home. We hadn't told Warren anything about the incident with Henrietta. Naturally, he must have expected us to arrive. Sipping coffee with Reagan at a cafe, I pondered this situation. Suddenly, Reagan's phone rang. He got up, answered the call, and stepped out of the cafe. I quickly paid the bill and followed him to the car. Reagan switched his phone to speaker mode so I could hear Warren's voice too. Dad, something strange is happening. All my relatives have suddenly made other plans and you and Mom haven't arrived yet. Even Henrietta's relatives are canceling one after another. What's going on? Feeling guilty about Warren's anxious tone but deciding to play dumb, we exchanged glances. Who knows what Henrietta's saying? Reagan asked casually, his acting so natural that it surprised me. Noticing my reaction, Reagan winked and gestured to keep it a secret. Suppressing a laugh, I covered my mouth. Henrietta seems confused too. Oh, another call's coming in. I'll call back later. Be safe coming over, I said, trying to sound casual. Warren still seemed to expect our visit, which made me feel guilty, but I convinced myself it was necessary to make a point to Henrietta. Then my phone rang. It was a relative who was supposed to attend today's party. Feeling apologetic but engaged in conversation, I chatted for a while. Meanwhile, Reagan's phone rang again. This time it was Warren. Reagan switched to speaker mode and answered. Dad, I just spoke to Henrietta's mom. What's going on? If you can still come, please do right away. Warren's voice sounded strained, almost on the verge of tears, which tightened my chest. Reagan glanced at me with concern. After a nod from me, he reassured Warren. We understand. We'll be right there. Calm down, Reagan replied soothingly. Warren sounded relieved and hung up. We were at a cafe near Warren's new home, so we drove there immediately. Upon arriving and ringing the doorbell, Warren rushed out to greet us. Behind him, Henrietta stood glaring at us with furious eyes. Once inside, Warren ushered us to the living room where we settled on the sofa. Eagerly, Warren began to ask, I didn't expect you to arrive so soon. Where were you? What's going on? All our relatives are angry, Henrietta's relatives are apologizing, and I have no idea what's happening. Calm down, Warren. First of all, congratulations on your new home. I began, trying to soothe him. I'll explain everything. Turning to Henrietta, who sat silently, I continued, You know why we're the only ones here, don't you? What do you mean? Henrietta feigned ignorance, prompting a slight sigh from me before I continued. It seems you didn't want us here, but given the current situation, your worries are over. I explained calmly. What does that mean? Warren sounded confused, his brow furrowing. I smiled slightly and continued. Both your relatives and ours know everything now. Unfortunately, your plans have failed. You've already been reprimanded by your relatives, haven't you? A low growl unmistakably from Henrietta interrupted. Reagan and I were astonished to hear her reaction for the first time, but I ignored it, maintaining eye contact with Henrietta. Now that your true nature is exposed, why don't you just accept it? I asked. I didn't invite you. Henrietta's voice was quieter now, making Warren lean in closer to hear her repeat herself. Suddenly, Henrietta raised her head, stood up, and began to yell. I didn't invite you. I told you not to come. Why did you come anyway? And spreading lies among the relatives, framing me, is that fun for you? Taken aback by her intensity, Warren recoiled. I sighed as Henrietta continued to insist she was the victim. Mobile phones are so handy, aren't they, Henrietta? I nodded at Reagan, who took out his phone, operated it, and then looked at Warren. I just wanted to marry Warren because he's good-looking and earns decently. I don't want to deal with troublesome relatives. Anyway, elderly folks like you, being of a different class, shouldn't come to the housewarming party. Henrietta's words from that day played from Reagan's mobile phone. Henrietta turned pale and glanced at Warren. After hearing the playback, Warren slowly turned to Henrietta, his mouth agape. Henrietta tried to deny it, but what excuse could she give after that recording? The weather turned bad, so I cut my walk short and came back only to hear this incredible conversation. I couldn't help but record it, Reagan explained regretfully. Warren looked at me for confirmation, and I nodded firmly. I couldn't believe it at first either, Warren, but the truth is there in the recording. Henrietta's true feelings in her last words were said despite my presence. It's hard to escape now, Reagan said, fixing his gaze on Henrietta. Could anyone stay calm knowing she had been deceiving everyone since her dating days with Warren, let alone after their marriage? Reagan continued. Seeing his stern look, Henrietta dropped her shoulders and ceased her struggle. This seemed like affirmation to Warren, who abruptly stood up and left the house. It happened so suddenly that we couldn't stop him. Although Reagan hurried after him, Warren soon returned. Apparently, Warren had driven off somewhere, leaving his mobile phone behind, making it impossible for us to call him. Henrietta was left behind, surrounded by us, trembling and pale, huddled up helplessly. Eventually, Warren returned, holding something in his hand, which he slammed in front of Henrietta. Send the divorce papers and leave, he said quietly. Henrietta looked up at Warren, her mouth agape, but Warren repeated himself. He took a pen from the holder on the table and began to fill in his part. After finishing, Warren forced the pen into Henrietta's hand and tapped on the divorce papers. Come on, sign and leave, he said forcefully. Overwhelmed, Henrietta, though frightened, filled in her part. She looked at Warren when finished. She looked at Warren when finished, but he avoided eye contact, checking for any missing details. Finding no errors, Warren forcefully made Henrietta stand up and dragged her to the front door. He pushed her outside, ignoring her attempts to cling to him and throwing her bag outside. It's late, so I'll submit this tomorrow. Don't ever come back to this property, Warren said, slamming the door shut and locking it. Henrietta's pleading voice could be heard from outside, but Warren ignored it and turned to apologize to us. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I had no idea she was like that." We could say nothing to his deep apology, just embracing him. Before long, Henrietta's voice faded away. We decided to stay at Warren's new home that night. The next morning, Warren submitted the divorce papers first thing, and his divorce from Henrietta was finalized. Concerned about his heartache, we chose to stay another night. That evening, with a somewhat calmer Warren, we discussed everything that had happened. As we recounted the past events, Warren listened with clenched fists. Reagan, who was also unaware of these details, placed his hand on my shoulder as I spoke. Then, we revealed the truth about the current situation after Henrietta had left, telling us not to come. I learned that Reagan had spontaneously recorded the conversation. Together, we decided to inform Henrietta's parents. When we called and explained the situation, Henrietta's parents initially were in disbelief but changed their attitude and kept apologizing after hearing the recorded audio. Angry about their daughter's misdeeds, they intended to inform the relatives who had planned to attend the housewarming party not to go. After hanging up, we discussed and decided to do the same with our relatives. They too were furious and said they wouldn't attend. That is how the current situation unfolded. Hearing all this, Warren's shoulders drooped again, worried but unable to do anything. We decided to spend another night. The next day, Warren came into the living room looking relieved and shared what happened the previous night. He had apparently contacted his former in-laws. Henrietta was now at her parents' home, being disowned and facing eviction. They also planned to bring alimony, which would be imposed on Henrietta as her debt. While Warren felt this was not enough, he seemed more settled than expected. After returning home, we immediately started packing up our old house. Now dated, it was set to be handed over as the house was being remodeled for us to live in together. Since Warren was at work during the day, the renovations were scheduled to take place then. Though costly to modify a newly built home with some financial gain from the recent events and our help, the decision was made. While waiting for the house's remodeling, we were happily clearing out our old home.